One of the several ways we mark our historic bicentenary here at Virginia Theological Seminary is by creating vehicles that capture the complexity of our history. Hello, I'm Ian Markham, Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary. In a series of conversations, we explore the ways in which ministry has been shaped by the moment at which we're called to serve. The seminary has been fortunate at having strong and effective board governance. In this video, we have the privilege of watching and listening in on the chair, Mr. David Charlton, and the vice chair, the Right Reverend Phoebe Rowe.
So I'm Phoebe Rowe, VTS class of 2008, and currently vice chair of the Board of Trustees.
And I'm David Charlton, currently the chair of the Board of Trustees.
I came to VTS in the fall of 2005 to begin my theological studies after careers in public policy and law. Part of the reason that I chose VTS was because my grandparents on my mother's side were still alive at the time and living in Washington, D.C. And I thought instead of seeing them once a year, I could drive over and see them once a week. So that was a big draw.
Special.
But also, I went through the discernment process in the Diocese of Louisiana. And so South Louisiana is probably 90% Roman Catholic. So there were not a lot of women in leadership roles in the church, even in Protestant denominations, because of the heavy Catholic influence. And to come to this campus and to interact with Martha Horn, who was the dean and president then, Mary Hicks, who was head of the money, and Marge McNaughton, who was dean of students, I thought, wow, three examples, different examples of strong women who would be wonderful role models for me as I was figuring out what this new vocation was even going to look like. And so I think it was a combination of the women who were in leadership, family proximity, and just the feel that I had when I was on the campus that I could make this place home. So that's what brought me here.
What a wonderful story. And here, all this time, I thought it was just us. And now I know it's your family. That's grand. Yeah. My story with Virginia Seminary starts long before I was even born. So there was an inevitability about it. My grandmother's older brother, my great uncle, was a member of the class of 1927. So he came to seminary here from San Antonio, Texas, went back and served parishes and became the Bishop of West Texas. And when my father mustered out of the Navy after World War II, he wanted to go to seminary. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. And so his uncle said, I can send you, but you can't come back to my diocese.
Right.
And so he was sent to Virginia Seminary, and along with many, many members of his class who were veterans. He graduated in 1949. And we went off. He apparently read what was over the altar in the chapel about going into the world and preaching the gospel, because we lived in Houston, Texas, Fairbanks, Alaska, when it was a territory, worked at the church center in New York, lived in Mexico City, and then came back to the United States, all as he went into the world to preach the gospel. It was a great way of growing up. Fast forward, he was the founding director of the field education program.
I didn't know that.
Yes, he was called by his former dean, Jess Trotter, one day at the church in Wilmington, Delaware, and he said, Gordon, I'm going to start a new program called field education. He said, the faculty are opposed to it, and the students are opposed to it, and most of the local clergy are opposed to it. Would you consider coming down and creating a program? Well, if you knew my dad, that would be irresistible. So off we came down here and lived in the house now occupied by the librarian. I was in high school. And so my brother and sister and I became faculty children on the campus earlier. So we moved here in the summer of 1967, as I said, for my father to be the founding director of the field education program. And I was a teenage boy of 16 with all that you can read into that.
Yes.
And we lived in the house occupied by the library in Missy Buddy now, which, if you know, the topography of the seminary is on a hill.
Yes.
And I had a 1959 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia, which I learned I could put into neutral without the engine running and quietly, without lights, roll down the hill over the curb and onto Seminary Road, at which point I could
turn it on
and do whatever it was I
You did at 16.
At 16. And then when I returned through the gates on Seminary Road, I would come by what was then Churchill Gibson, the chaplain's house, that house right there.
Yes.
And before I got to our driveway, cut the lights and turn the motor off and coast downhill to the same parking space that I had been in a couple of hours before. And my parents, probably in a parenting failure, chose to they had 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 down. They put my brother and sister upstairs and
put you downstairs,
which probably was a strategic mistake. But yes, that's one of the stories that people get a good laugh about, is David rolling down the hill in the quiet and the dark, his Carmen Ghia just to sight time. And then he stayed here until he went back to Texas as Dean of Seminary of the Southwest and subsequently elected bishop, but we mostly stayed in Virginia. And I entered the family business, which is educating about that. So I came back in 1985 as the business officer and went on to become the president of the Church Schools Corporation and do the other things that I do. And Bishop Lee, for better or for worse, appointed me to the board back when bishops appointed people to the board.
Right.
And so I came full circle in all those different roles.
You've been on the board since what, 84?
No. Sometime in the 90s.
In the 90s. Okay, got it.
And in those days, there were no term limits. I had a close relationship in many ways with Bishop Lee, who was Bishop of this diocese for 25 years and was his treasurer, among other things. And when Martha Horn wanted to retire, he asked me to chair the search committee to seek a successor. And it was a large search committee.
It was.
And you were one of the student representatives on that committee, but it had 3 bishops, 2 students, I believe.
Joe Hensley and
2 or 3 faculty. And some trustees. And so I think those of us who were on that committee have a special relationship. We were asked to bring an ordained Episcopal priest who taught in an Episcopal seminary, who had a lot of parish experience, and we found an Englishman who was not ordained, who was teaching in a non-denominational seminary. And we were totally smitten by him. We ended up calling him, and Ian Markham has been a fabulous dean at this seminary. But there was that moment where we had to present him to the Board of Trustees.
Yes, I think that the dean and president's intelligence, faithfulness, fabulous sense of humor, and energy, it was palpable. It was clear that he was a man who was on a mission, on fire for the gospel as a committed layperson, and had the energy and the vision to take VTS into this new era that we're currently in.
It was magnificent. He had entered the ordination process. And I remember we asked Dr. Lewis, as part of our presentation, to speak about dean as deacon.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yes.
So that was a wonderful.
So I graduated in 2008 and returned to New Orleans, the city where I had been living before seminary, and served 3 years as associate rector of Trinity in the Garden District. And then I was called to be the rector of St. Philip's in this diocese in Richmond. And I was not super involved with the seminary in my first 3 years out, partially because of the geographic distance. But once I was in Richmond, I figured it's just right down the road a piece. So let me find ways to get more engaged. And it was really too far to do field work. But after I'd been there maybe a couple of years, I was asked to consider running for the AAEC, the Alumni Association. And so I did that, and I served the full term, the first year as a member, the second year as the chair. And so when I was on the AAEC, that gave me a designated spot on the board. And when those 2 years were over, Ian asked if I would consider running for a full 5-year term. So 7 years now.
Yeah, that was an important change. We inherited a governance system where the founding dioceses, of which there were 2 in 1823, had become 7.
Exactly, right. The relationships that you form as a seminarian that are lifelong are not just with people in your class. It's also with faculty. And so 2 of the faculty members that I had the deepest relationships when I was here were the Reverend Dr. Tony Lewis, New Testament scholar, and the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams, Old Testament scholar. And so when I was ordained priest in July of 2008, Dr. Lewis came to New Orleans to preach at my ordination. And then when I was consecrated bishop in 2019, the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress Williams was the preacher at my consecration. So those are 2 people that I have stayed in touch with over the years. And in fact, being on the board for 7 years has helped to facilitate those connections, because prior to COVID, I was on campus 2 or 3 times a year and would always try to make time to check in with them when I was here. The Episcopal Church, like so many other institutions, has had a complicated history, especially when it comes to the interaction of the races. And Bishop Payne Library, of course, is named for the former seminary that was in Petersburg, Virginia, I believe, Bishop Payne Divinity School, where if you were a man of color, because of course they weren't ordaining women then, but if you were a man of color, that was really your only option for theological education. And so when I came here, Dr. Michael Battle was on faculty, Dr. Tony Lewis, Dr. Judy Fentress Williams. Those 3 were important to me to kind of see at the faculty and administrative level, persons of color. Of course, we had Dr. John Ye.
Dr. Eversley?
Yeah, no, Dr. Eversley maybe on a part-time basis, but not sort of permanent. And then Joseph Thompson was working here. And Joseph ended up doing an amazing book about the Black experience at Virginia Theological Seminary. You know, as a seminarian here, I am Southern. I've grown up in the South, and so I understand the Southern culture. And I think sometimes people say things with intention, and sometimes people say things just because they don't. If you don't have a person of color in your inner circle, you may not even be aware of our sort of daily lived realities. And so there were absolutely, in class and outside of class, sometimes insensitive comments made. And, you know, it's always sort of a balancing act. Whatever your particular race, ethnicity, embodied form, what ditches are you going to die in, right? You have to dust a lot of things off. But at what point are you going to say, let me just stand up and say something? And I was not reticent about
Phoebe,
that.
I would love it if you would give an example of something that you dust off and something a minute.
You know, comments about hair, I would say, or asking, you know, can I touch your hair?
Yeah.
That is something that, I'm used to, and like, no, you cannot touch my hair. And so when I came in 2005, I started the process of dreadlocks. So I came with a short natural like this, and by the time I graduated, after 3 years, I had dreadlocks. So that was really a fascinating transition with my hair for some of my white classmates. But I would say the sorts of things where the inherent intelligence or capacity of an African American or a woman or any sort of group, when those sorts of things were raised, that's when I had to kind of raise my hand and say, y'all, come on now. We're all Christians.
And even for a woman with degrees from Harvard and Princeton.
Doesn't matter.
As a lawyer.
Doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So as a seminarian, there were some conversations about those issues. And I think, of course, the larger culture impacts us, right, as the church. And so I think the election of Barack Obama and the election of Donald Trump had a huge impact on this campus. And we had to learn, how are we going to live together when there were people who voted for and against both of the former presidents, and some issues arose. And I forgot, Danielle McCrae was here for a time. As I'm thinking back, Allison St. Louis, right? And so seminarians, when I would come on campus 2 times a year for the board meetings, seminarians of color would approach me in the refectory or after chapel and say, can I talk to you about some of the things that I'm experiencing? And so you and the dean really asked a couple of us, people of color on the board, Michelle Hagans and myself, I'm remembering, to just do some listening and to come back and report to the board and to think through, how can we as the board, right at the board level, we're kind of at the 35,000 foot level, right? I mean, we got to trust the faculty and the administration to run the campus. And I think we agreed, we never wanted to micromanage. And yet there's certain issues where the board's comment or posture can make a huge impact. And so I think we did a lot of powerful listening that led, to Joseph Thompson, who had moved into Joseph Constant's position after he created this intercultural competency experience to invite board members to do an abbreviated version. And I don't know about you, David, but that was really powerful for me.
It was eye-opening. I participated in it, and I'm so glad.
Mm-hmm.
Learned a lot. So I think that was significant for us as a board, because it's so very easy to not talk about unpleasant things.
Right.
And to pretend that the past didn't happen.
Right.
And of course, even somebody like me with my many generations of experience here, I didn't know a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that we leased slaves from Mount Vernon to build Aspinwall, for example. So I think that experience that Joseph gave us opened the door for the board to think about, what's our job with this?
Right.
And I think we started with, first we need to know our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to know, what are we going to do about that story?
Mm-hmm.
And, you can talk about the parts of that you remember interested, but one in particular that struck me when a part of what we wanted to do was consider true reparations in the form of trying to, on some level, compensate descendants of those. What was so compelling to me was when Ian presented the intergenerational lost opportunity to create equity.
Correct.
And said, look, our ancestors may have been prudent or they may have been profligate, but they at least had the opportunity to be compensated for their labor.
Correct.
And save if they were so moved, and leave something for the generation that followed. And we denied that.
Right. I was shocked to know that during Jim Crow, Black workers on campus were paid, I believe, Black men 20% of what white men were paid.
Yes.
And of course, during slavery, they didn't reap any of those benefits.
No. So that was compelling to me on that particular point. And I thought, we can never repay this. It'll at best be a gesture, but it's an important gesture because we denied the ability to build wealth to that population.
Yeah.
And then obviously there were other things, the relationships, the descendants.
Right.
So maybe you found those.
Yeah. I think you and I have worked well together as board chair and co-chair, because you came to your role as the first ever layperson, non-bishop, to be the chair, very much as a person with this wonderful, amazing history. And I came to it as a lifelong Episcopalian, but without the history connected to BTS. And in some ways, the decision that we made to call Ian Markham as dean and president gave us a man deeply steeped in Anglican tradition, but totally outside of the Southern American context. And I think a Southern man or woman may have had more difficulty seeing all of this. Ian could almost look at it objectively more, maybe more clinically, because he doesn't swim in this water, but this is water that I swim in, right? So I'm a fish in this water. So even, both of us with our connections here, whether long or short, we learn so many things. But Ian really came at it objectively, scientifically, almost from a research perspective. That has been really helpful.
And I don't think he would claim courageously, but I would award him courageously.
I would too.
But what should we say about the bicentennial? Great love shown. And when we engaged the challenging question of what to do with the Assyrian reliefs, due partly to the destruction of antiquities in the Middle East, they had increased in value exponentially, and it was irresponsible for us to leave them
in their prior location, in the basement of the library,
in between the ladies and the bedrooms on the wall,
subject to flooding or anything.
Anybody, vandal or anybody. So I think that was a big challenge, and there were strong opinions about what should and shouldn't be done. But I think the board responsibly worked through that with the faculty and ended up selling one relief, which allowed us the funding to create a space to preserve and curate and make available the others and have an exact replica of it. So that was important. And let me mention the joint real estate bank.
But yeah, we have been through so much since I've been on the board. The beloved chapel burned. And, that chapel, I had sort of a love-hate relationship. I mean, it was creaky, it was old, there was no place to gather before the liturgy, it wasn't handicap accessible, and yet those walls were soaked in prayer. And having that building that was open 24 hours a day. So even in the middle of the night, if there were burdens on your heart, to know you could walk into that space and just be present with the Lord. It was a powerful experience. And so that burned, and that was sort of the genesis of, I don't know, was that our first ever capital campaign as a seminary?
No, there was a small capital campaign associated with the Addison building.
Got it. But that was huge. And you were like, here, right? Yeah. Now, was Bud the chair of the board when that happened?
I think he was. Bishop Lee retired in 2009.
Yes.
I think that's when Bishop Shan took over. Well, to your comment about the chapel, I just want to observe what a wonderful ability maybe that chapel had, but that you had to hold contradictory things. I mean, that place you're describing also had plaques on the wall to the honor of people that had owned people and had done some of the things that we've talked about earlier. And they're on those walls too.
Yep, exactly.
And so for you to be able to hold those contradictions, I think and maybe for the chapel to hold those contradictions is extraordinary. And of course, that's part of our history, and that it's not part of the new chapel, but it is part of our history that we preserve.
And the fact that, because of the historic nature of the old chapel, we now have this amazing columbarium and outdoor garden and
lovely,
meditation place. It's lovely. I'm glad that we kept the remaining walls and we didn't just clear them.
Given all the conversations that in my hearing over the years about the shortcomings of the former chapel, I think the only way we would have arrived at this point was the way we arrived.
Yes, I think you're right.
I don't think we ever would have voluntarily raised that or changed it in significant ways. It would have been too hard to do.
Yes.
So it all works out somehow.
So then, as I'm remembering, the next significant undertaking that the board took, and of course with your financial background, you were such a helpful part of the process, was this longstanding question of the distinction between single or at least coming to seminary without spouse and partner versus married.
Right.
And, when I was here, the only people living on campus were those who were single or those who left spouses or partners at home. All the families were renting all throughout the area. And, because of the finances and interest rates and things of that nature, it became a prudent financial decision to build on campus family housing so that we would basically pay the mortgage from what we had been using to subsidize those other living accommodations. And then once the mortgages on these buildings are paid off, we'll have that money for ourselves. So what was your sense of that whole process of doing that?
Well, the need was always there.
Yeah.
From my longest past memories, we were aware that we'd created obstacles or challenges to full participation for these families, and Northern Virginia real estate being what it was just getting incredibly more and more expensive all the time. But I think the confluence was that some years earlier we had recognized, like many institutions did, that we needed to be very disciplined about our reliance on drawing income from our endowment, and that we had this magnificent relationship with the Letty Pate Evans Foundation, which sent us income at a very high level, and it grew very fast. And we imposed on ourselves a discipline in both of those, which allowed the creation of a material capital reserve. So there was that at the same time too. So we took the opportunity to build the 40 apartments, and yes, at some point those lines will cross. And,
Yes.
and we were a little worried about overbuilding.
Correct.
And naturally, there were those that pointed out that whatever number we built wasn't quite enough.
Right, exactly.
It should have been 45 instead of 40.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But I do think it's given the seminary wonderful options, and that was important.
Yeah.
And it opens the door to that kind of thinking.
Right.
We look at all of our facilities and some of these houses that have been built over the decades and how we use them. We have property across the street, some of which is more productively utilized than others, and so we have to think about that. And I think that's the job of a board and a dean to do that. And that brings us to what's on our plate, I guess, at the moment.
Yes. I do think in my current seat as the bishop of a small diocese, the whole nature of theological education has to be reconsidered. When you look at the numbers, they can be sobering. I believe we have double the number of retirements currently of Episcopal clergy as people being ordained. And more than half of my congregations, David, are missions right now. And of my missions, about half have a half-time priest who's there with a contract paying roughly half of minimum. The other half are just using supply clergy or catch as catch can with maybe a Eucharist once a month and lay people leading morning prayer the other weeks. And so, if VTS, as I believe the largest theological education program in the Anglican Communion, if one of our primary purposes is to serve the church, and the church is undergoing profound transformation, and we know that not everyone is going to be able to have the 3-year full-time residential experience that I had, and quite frankly, that was just instrumental in my formation. How do we serve a church in a rural area where the whole population has declined based upon employment trends and other things? They will never be able to have a full-time priest, and yet the people there are faithful and they want to be a witness of Christ. And so how do we help prepare those congregations? Because I think moving into the future, there are going to be more of those sorts of congregations than, the large multi-clergy, multi-staff congregations that you and I have been affiliated with over the years. And the board is going to have to grapple with those issues, I think, moving forward.
And it has sort of competing elements, doesn't it? I mean, we could produce more graduates.
Right.
You know, we have the capacity to do that. So if the problem was just more people retiring than being ordained, I'm not saying it's easy, but we could do something about that. But that doesn't respond to what you just described. Mm-hmm. Missions that need subsidy, bivocational.
Yes.
And so I do think that that is something that we have to decide. If the church needs that, who can provide it?
Exactly. And it may not be us, but what resources might we have to bear to assist if another institution is going to prepare clergy to serve in that context? And we hate to create, though, sort of a bifurcated clergy where if you've done the sort of 3-year traditional,
your class one.
Right. And we got rid of the Canon 9, right?
Yes.
And we don't do that anymore.
Yes.
And yet those issues that led to the creation of the Canon 9 clergy are still here. And because of COVID, it's even more exacerbated than it was before.
And that was such a valuable canon when I was a little boy in the territory of Alaska. Many of the clergy were Canon 9 clergy, including the Bishop of Alaska.
Wow.
Had started out as he'd been a lay person in Alaska, he'd been ordained and later was consecrated. And so I hope that'll be revisited.
Yes.
But, categories of clergy makes me a little uneasy. But I don't think we have the luxury to just crank out people that had the experience that you had if the church can't place them.
Exactly. Agreed. Agreed.
I mean, they're wonderful, but we've got to put them in a position where they can serve.
Because it's a huge sacrifice, not only for those individuals, but for their families. Yeah. For 3 years of full-time study, they're not able to work. If they have to relocate, I mean, it's a lot. So, I definitely think we need to also be mindful of the sacrifices that family members make in terms of supporting those of us, with the ordained vocation. We couldn't do it without the support of our families.
Well, maybe, if not the last, approaching the last thing we should talk about is to look beyond our borders.
Yes.
To think about our place in the communion. And, the communion has divisions.
It does.
Over issues that are somewhat resolved in this country, but not resolved in other continents and countries. Leadership is kind of an interesting question. Who leads in our tradition? And this institution, of course, from its earliest days, believed that its mission was to prepare people beyond our shores. So what does that look like to you, do you think, in the future?
Well, I have to say that all of the international clergy who studied here and most of the seminarians who were from abroad were already ordained in their context, coming here for more advanced study. That really was a great introduction to me of just the diversity of the Anglican communion, and was an important part of my time here as a seminarian. How we might think about additional ways to be partners. And I understand that right now we do have sort of informal partnership agreements with 3 international seminaries: Msalato in Tanzania,
Hong Kong,
Minghua in Hong Kong, and is it Coddington and Oxford? There's also an association with Oxford. And so, again, as you mentioned with the VTS-GTS partnership, how many more of these sort of informal arrangements will VTS have the capacity to enter into to help strengthen the bonds of affection among members in the Anglican communion? I think the fact that we have CACS, the Center for Anglican Communion Studies, speaks to the role of VTS, not just within TEC, the Episcopal Church, but the larger communion. And my hope is that center will continue to flourish and expand its offerings. If COVID hasn't taught us anything else, David, it's that the world is a lot smaller than what we thought. And something that happens in another part of the world because of wonderful marvels of airplanes and all sorts of international travel, it's on our shores right away. and vice versa. So whether it's, COVID, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's raising up the capacity of women as full participants in society, there's so many issues that transcend national borders that VTS, I think, is ideally situated to be a safe space to bring people together with various perspectives. We don't have to agree on everything, but can we at least be in conversation with one another and be in relationship? That's a part of VTS's future that I have a lot of excitement about and energy and passion for.
I agree with that. I think we quite intentionally staked out our ground as being a place that everybody can come and be heard. And if that's middle of the road or whatever you want to call it, that's who we are. And when Martha Horn retired, she gave a great address to the board in which she hit a couple of points you just made. One was, she said, you're so blessed and fortunate here, you can really consider doing almost anything, but you cannot do everything.
That's correct.
And you will have a lot of suitors and a lot of proposals, and you just need to think carefully about which ones you've got the capacity to support. So I think that is great. But she also noted, so I think that is still before us. How much of that can we do? But one of the things she noted was she said, Virginia Seminary has great convening authority, was the term she used. And I think we have lived into that. We have the ability to be that middle place, to bring those people. We have the facilities, we have the funds, we can create those fora for them to have to discuss with one another. And I think that's where the Anglican Community Studies Center came from, was we began to see we can accommodate these groups, we can invite them, we can convene them. I hope that will be a part of what we can do and more going forward. An interesting change I remember in the international thing was, this before my time, but perhaps in my father's time as a seminarian, they understood that to be to prepare American priests to go there.
Right.
And by the time you and I came along, it was, no, we don't do that anymore.
No.
We bring their leaders here to give them whatever additional support and education and training that we can do so that they can go back and be leaders in their own countries. And I think we've got a pretty good record there.
I think our extensive alumni base, serving really all over the world, is one of the great enduring legacies of this institution. Because really, at the board level, we're supporting the dean and president, the administration, the faculty, to prepare the laymen and laywomen who are the ones who really are going out into all the world to spread the gospel. And so to just imagine all these successive generations of VTS alumni, from your family and even before that, from 1823 moving forward. Wow, what an amazing legacy, the impact VTS alum have had on the church writ large. So 200 years in, it's amazing to think about what the next 100 years will bring.
Exactly.
And I think the church is going to look really different, David. It's not just about what happens on Sunday morning for 3 hours. It's every single day.
We renovated a lot of very old buildings that were much in need.
Yes.
Improved the library, improved the refectory.
The academic building, Addison. We also repurposed Key Hall, which is now Bicentennial Hall. We also had Mark Jefferson, one of our professor of homiletics, to deliver 200 sermons, both domestically and internationally, to celebrate 200 years.
Are you running now?
Yes.
The bicentennial campaign built in fabulous ways on the chapel campaign.
Yes, it did.
They always say that a good campaign is helped by previous campaigns. Set all kinds of records. We were able to renovate a lot of the older buildings that very much needed it. The academic center, the library,
the refectory,
dining hall,
the deanery,
the welcome center next door is next on the list. Some infrastructure that's not as visible. And then our wonderful 1823 cafe, club, indoor, outdoor place where the community can gather and mix with the local community, not just the seminary community. And I think Don't you think it has really raised our profile and the affection in which this institution is held?
I've been amazed at the, Ian and Barney Hawkins and the whole institutional development team. We have non-Episcopalians who believe in the importance of this institution, who supported both the chapel campaign and the bicentennial campaign.
And the creation of round tables, they call them, in all these cities across the country, which creates the structure for when Virginia comes to town.